So this is where we wanted to introduce ourselves as per the One Show, but we thought that might be a bit cheesy, didn't we, Liz? So Liz is also a visiting professor at Staffordshire, but also heavily involved in Scotland. Some of you might have come across. So what we're going to do today, hopefully, as well as take up an hour of your time, is actually think about what that means, this learning in post-colonial times. And I say coronial, not colonial, and we might allude to why we think that's still a very useful word to purpose later on. So the background to a bit of the work is that we were commissioned to look at evaluative perspectives of digital learning for a book that's just coming out, more of which later. And it also builds on some work that Liz and I have done in the past around looking at digital capability and excellence. So we had a bit of an insight into it, we felt before. And as I said, the post-colonial concerns the key learning that is post-pandemic, if we think we're post-pandemic, by the way. And the wording will come to light, but it's basically about privilege and of power. And we'll see why. We're going to hopefully present you with a bit of provocation why we don't necessarily think that the EdTech revolution has been as good as it apparently is. So I'm going to do the little blurb, and Liz will probably come in. So it's still me. So just to share with you about this, you can see there in the contested space, and the chapter that we've done in the recent literature, it's about some of our own learning as well, and the evidence about looking at evaluative design within the context of COVID particularly. And what we found is an intensely contested area with two primary dimensions, almost working as binary opposites. And one concerned the hype and marketing regarding how EdTech corporations, we all know who they are, AWS, Microsoft, etc., have come in and saved the day, and presumably have for HE learners, be the expansion on Teams, new learning platforms, and albeit with kind of stunning agility. And I don't think anybody would contest that. That's counterpoised, though, by some emerging voices that Liz and I found of dissent, which argue that the datafication of learning and also assumptions about tech access have actually increased inequalities within the HE sector on an unprecedented scale. So that's the first bit there you can see. And then the second point relates to assumptions about digital learning platforms, and as either connected, accessible, or viable places, are actually prone to machine learning. They're less interactive, they're competency-based, and also can be socially isolating. And they're probably both, but we wanted to explore those. So, EdTech saviors, there we go. So the knights in shining armour coming in to save us. So this certainly came out to play, didn't it, during COVID, whether by offering an enhanced Teams experience, and which flexed quickly to accommodate HE needs, or enacting quickly to offer proctoring solutions for assessment purposes, for proctoring some read fairness, others read intrusive surveillance, so you might want to think about that. Many companies have developed platforms which can be accessed by smartphone technology, so that on-the-go learning is realistic, all good. Uber here, as you can see on there, relates to the company, not a journey. It's EdTech's can use a dynamic pricing model in HE based on local supply and demand, which they do, and arguably also on moral panic during the pandemic phase. And these models are often differentiated by price point options for services. And then, of course, working quickly and getting platforms and services to market define the agility with which massive commercial corporations can move. And they're much more attractive, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that, than the QA/QE models that are characterised in higher education. And that's another reason, in theory, why the learner's been saved. And then the final bit I just want to throw out there is this idea of tracking and tracing. And of course, it's been sold to us all that, you know, and I've used loads of platforms where you can see who's gone in, use the platform, how long they've stayed in for, and that's seen as a good thing. But actually, this might be counterbalanced by some more interesting ideas. So, the other bit as well is there a competing reality here? So, this rush to inception and delivery of learning digitally has resulted in being pedagogically devoid. I've seen lots of stuff, I don't know about you, where there's been some great tech, but not a lot of thought about actually the learning that goes into it, and what discussions have been had when translating that with the learner. Many companies also use data to nudge student behaviour, but it's also timely to recall that the behaviour is not synonymous with learning, hence focusing on data alone does not equate to learning. A student can also learn how to circumvent anti-plagiarist tools, yet that behaviour does not make it a good learning experience. The other thing is, has HE apparent inability to cope been unnecessarily problematised? Liz and I looked at some literature which suggests that actually it's been created as what we call a wiki problem, which isn't one. So many colleges have found fantastic ways, and there are some people in this room, of facilitating brilliant learning through understanding pedagogy, not always through technology. And then there's other evidence of dissension that we found was that some areas of technological advances are lacking criticality. That actually what we need to be looking at here is what's the purpose of the technology and what we're trying to achieve with that. And then arguably inflexibility. For some people, for example, who don't have the latest smartphone, are we ruling some people out from some of the things that we're creating, some of the platforms? And you know, Stafford's got a proud tradition of making sure that students can have accessible technology and, you know, Surface Pro, blah, blah, blah. But actually, there are some areas in the sector where we found that it's actually railed against students. And then this thing again of tracking and tracing, this comes back again. And one of the things that we found was that, you know, is data always being used for the right purpose? Do you know where that data is going when people are collecting it on massive platforms? And there's a lot of evidence out there that perhaps data is being purposed in different ways. Okay, Liz.
So it's quite easy for Stella and I to stand up here and make these suggestions around the transition to and use of big digital technology. But what we also want to do is make sure that we provided an evidence base for this. So what you can see on the screen today, and you have this in front of you, if anyone's at a table with a handout, and we can distribute more equally if there's people that haven't got them. You can see on the two sides here we've got evidence that relate to the mantra of the big edtech companies, and then the corresponding evidence on the other side. So if we consider some of the language that's used, particularly if you look at the AWS Cloud, the THE Campus, Microsoft Learn, they're using words such as equitable, access, we're talking about connection, learning and sharing. There's a nudge or a nod to inclusivity, to belonging, and this is in comparison to some of the things that we found in some of the literature that we looked at for our book chapter. So on the other side of the screen and of the handout in front of you, you can see some of the evidence that we also found. Again, alluding to some of the points that Stella has made, reinforcing some of the points that we've already made. So we've got quotes here which allude to the fact that higher education in the digital space, but maybe not specific or limited to the digital technology space, has become a digital service-led or a service-led arena. And that's something that we need to think about critically, and we will do in the next activity. As Stella alluded to again, look at the quotes that talk about the devoid of pedagogic thought. What has been the underpinning rationale for some of the changes that have developed? And can we see a follow through of good pedagogic thinking in the development of the activities, the designs, the implementation that we're now seeing in our learning and teaching spaces? As an evaluator, I'm really interested in the notion of criticality. I think evaluation and our understanding of what's working is an extension of critical thinking. What the challenge is here, and can be seen on the screen, and is some of our ethos as well, is whether there has been an uncritical adoption in some of these spaces. And when are we going to get to the point where we have a critical stance on what we are developing and using? And what that means is potentially a more reflexive or flexible approach to what might be working or not working in different spaces across our learning and teaching arena, but potentially with this kind of critical core at the basis of it. And by critical, I don't mean that's problematizing. I mean that we're asking questions of whether something's the right thing to be doing or whether something is working. Okay. So what we would like you to do, so that there is a little bit of not just us kind of musing our thoughts on the future of digital tech and digital education, we'd like to know what you think as well. So on your tables you have a handout both of the compelling evidence that we presented in the first slide and also these questions in the second. What we're particularly interested in is this kind of competing agenda. So are we confident of claims around digital learning? Do we know that the kind of post-coronial learning has been evaluated effectively? Do we know what's working and what's not working? And have we been given the time and space to do that? Do we have any new insights? What have we learned, and how have we applied that to our new context? Or is there anything else that we need to know to make our life easier? Are your students happier with their new learning approaches? Do you know? How do you know? And what evidence base is that alluding to? Has EdTech saved HE is one of the big questions. That might be something that you want to discuss. Do we know where our data is going? So there is a data revolution associated with the big educational technology that we now use. But how is it being used? How much data is sat on a platform and not looked at? And that could give us some insights into engagement or learning. And is there any new pedagogical insights that we want to allude to? And how could we develop that thinking, supportive thinking, collaborative thinking in spaces such as this one in this conference? So we have a period of time, 10 to 15 minutes for conversation, thought, discussion. Stella and I will then ask for a little bit of feedback. Think about those questions, think about the evidence, have a conversation on the table. Which side of the coin do you fall? Do you think that we have educational technology, those big digital platforms, as a saviour? Or are we adopting a more critical stance about actually we need to do a little bit more learning and thinking about this? So,
we wanted to make sure that, sorry, I better get near the microphone. We wanted to make sure that you had the time to talk rather than us talk at you. So we'd really like you to think about this. And of course, I'm already preempting, it'll be all things and everything. But actually, it'd be really interesting, particularly Staffordshire is committed to a kind of digital future and does some great stuff. It'd be fascinating to hear your thoughts on some of these things, because we did find some binary opposites when we really looked at the evidence. Okay, about 15 minutes, it'd be nice for you to talk to each other, and then we'll probably come round and poke a microphone at you, if you will. Thank you.
Right, okay everyone, we would like to get some feedback from you on your thoughts on the questions that we've posed, the evidence that we presented, our musings around how we've developed in the space of digital learning and digital education. So, has EdTech saved HE? Are we on which side of the coin are we on? Anybody like to offer their reflections? Stick your hand up and Stella will come.
Well, during the pandemic, it certainly did, and especially at our university, we quickly adapted to using Teams or Collaborate. We had lots of sessions around how to learn how to teach online, and we had a great uptake. We've never trained so many academics. You know, the numbers were phenomenal, and if we actually look back on the training we actually did. So the technology actually did save us in the pandemic, because without it, we couldn't collaborate. We couldn't reach our students.
Absolutely, I think that's a story at many universities, and specifically that one around the investment in staff training. I suppose my challenge back to that point would be, why is that different to what we were doing before? So did we have the same investment in our previous kind of teaching approaches? And what have we learned from that? I mean, have we got a continuation of staff development, for example, in different pedagogic spaces? And they're potentially some of the questions to ask, aren't they, to follow it up? But yeah, yes, yeah. Brill, thank you. I think we've got a question over there, Stella, as well.
Okay, I don't want to say I disagree, but I don't take it as a black and white. I believe that it's not about the technology, it's about the content, it's about the student. In terms of feedback from students, I had the experience in Dubai and I'm new to Staffordshire. I believe that the majority of the students, they don't get, or they don't perceive it in a good way in terms of online. I think the technology itself, we were not ready and we need time for it. So even during the pandemic, we use it because we have to use it. But we know that in terms of implementation, it was not easy at all, not for us, not for the student. other than that, I'm trying to experiment. For example, I'm trying to do some work with breakout rooms or things like that. Sometimes it's helping, so I don't think we can generalize and say that the technology saved the higher education. I don't think so. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we have an evidence base around how our students both engaged with the technology that was on offer, the design, and it's about where do we take that and what do we learn from it. I love the idea of managed experimentation. I think that's a really good approach, followed by a kind of, and did that work? So the learning from experimentation, if you've got those safe spaces in order to be able to do that, I think is really good, really useful. Anybody else? I felt like I should have gone a bit like that in The Matrix when that happened.
So my view on this really is not that EdTech saved HE. I think it was a vehicle. What I actually think saved HE during the last couple of years was the people that implemented it. So it's actually people's use of it and adaptation to it and the training that we offered. So I'm going back to Chris's point. You know, we trained a lot of colleagues on using some of the tools, but it wasn't necessarily the use of the tool, but it wasn't necessarily the tool, but the way they used it, the way they adapted to it, that made the difference. So I think, and as we move out of sort of the pandemic era, or lockdown era, I think that going forward, again, with people and how they use EdTech going forward, what they keep that works well, you know, how they develop things going forward, that is going to save HE, not the tech itself, but the people using it.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. So that underpinning ethos of both staff development, that we need the collaboration and the learning and the spaces in order to both engage with the technology but then apply it in our own context, and critical to that is the staff base and the knowledge and understanding and skills of the staff base, and also confidence. I think certainly confidence has developed in certain spaces. I don't know if it's developed in all spaces, but certainly in some of the ones that have been using technology quite proficiently. And there was a certain experimentation in the early stages, I think, wasn't there, of using this technology. I'm always a big believer in don't take yourself too seriously, and if it goes wrong, it's fine. You know, we were in that space quite a lot of the time, weren't we? And yeah, we saw the funny side of that many a time. Any other comments on any kind of pedagogical insights, anything that we've learned about how learning and teaching has developed in these spaces?
So I think, you know, expanding upon what everyone said already, I think it's created a lot of new opportunities for academics and students and researchers to go beyond the classroom. You know, what additional simulation-based activities, safer spaces can we use, but also can the students play with to help their knowledge, their understanding around some of the very practical subjects as well that they couldn't necessarily do in their own home, but now actually they have the opportunity to. So I think that's been a real opportunity that, you know, we can still make use of. Likewise, you know, what Matt was saying around how academics utilise the tools. You know, you can't deliver a session in the same way online versus as you would in person. And if you design your activity in that way, it's not going to be perceived as well. So there are very different, you know, both in the literature but based on experience, very different approaches to using digital tools for delivery and to help the students learn.
Brill, thank you. And that really speaks to the notion of inclusivity, that we have adapted. You know, for example, at Hallam, some of our large-scale work placements became virtual work placements, and the accessibility for some of our students who would then have been travelling quite far, it happened in a different space. Has anybody seen the flip side of that, where, so to counter that point, where the move to the dominance of online or the use of digital tools has had a negative impact on inclusivity? So has that impact been felt the same by all of our students? Has it been positive for all? Yeah, and then we'll come back to Rachel.
I think
on the subject area. I think some subject area probably require it. You know, for example, my son was studying different place altogether. He was doing performing, he was doing acting. And he was about to do a study because he did not want to do online, so against it. But I think it depends on also on the, you know, what the background of those subject areas, what students' background is.
Yeah, okay, so the discipline of study and the activities that are embedded within that course can make that distinction. Thank you, yeah.
And it depends on the student, you know, so many students wanted the opportunity to do it at home, but then felt like for whatever reason they couldn't actually engage with it, whether they were distracted, whether there was other things happening, you know, whether it was pets, whether it was you know, just ability to not concentrate, and they were too comfortable, and therefore they weren't able to be as active. The concern around being recorded or turning their cameras on, I think, whilst was a good opportunity for some, was actually very intimidating, you know, for more of them than not.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to move on from that discussion, and I'm really thankful for those that have contributed to that, to give that perspective beyond our thoughts and our insights. And I just want to move on to this notion of and how do we know? And how do we know that this has been of benefit for certain students, and how our staff have felt about it, and whether our staff development has worked, and what decisions we might make in the future. And it all comes back to this notion of moving beyond just doing, but then thinking about what we know. And it goes back to this notion of evaluating. And I would talk about this because this is what I spend most of my time talking about at the moment. But it has resonance here for what we, all the time, it has resonance here for what we do in the future. So that's why I wanted to bring it in here. And I've said before, evaluation for me is just an extension of critical thinking. It's about asking questions of what we're doing and then employing a methodology in relation to evidence gathering, essentially. But so some of the things I think we need to think about going forward, particularly in this space, is that we need to be critical of our data use. So we need to be thinking about what data we're using to provide an evidence base for whether something has worked or not worked. We need to thinking about how they align to what we hoped it would achieve. And we need to be thinking about where that data has come from, who owns it, and how it could be used or has been used previously. And I think there is a need to be critical of that, whether that is your module evaluations from your students, your student feedback, or it's something through your learner analytics system, or whatever it is that you're triangulating together. Just having a critical stance on where it's come from and how it's been used, I think, is important. I think there is a danger sometimes that we oversimplify what we are looking to evaluate. So the connection between what we do and what we had hoped to achieve sometimes is a very either not rationalised or can be an oversimplified process. And what we need is a triangulation of information to get the most out of our evaluative spaces. So thinking about taking bits of evidence from different spaces, different places, collected and used for different ends. We also need to think about this notion of a counterfactual, one of Stella's most favourite words. The counterfactual is what might have happened if we hadn't done this, okay? And how do we know? Or what could we do instead? Again, it's a line of critical questioning. Now, when we moved at scale to a position of online learning, there were very, very few pockets that we could compare to say, well, they've done it and they've not done it. Let's compare the experiences. So maybe we can think about what might have happened if these over here hadn't done it. We can start to explore. So that's been difficult at scale when we've all moved in big institutional change to certain platforms and certain ways of working. But I don't think that's the case now. I think moving forward we can think about smaller changes or smaller enhancements and then think about the comparators. So this is happening in this space, but it's not happening over here, and how do those experiences compare? So that notion of the counterfactual, of what else could be happening in this space, or what else could we do instead of X intervention with our students, is a really important point. There is also a risk, I think, of bad evaluation, of performative evaluation, tick box, we've done it. The things that we want to think about in terms of who is evaluating, a power dimension to evaluation. We think about who is designing evaluation and what methods are being chosen and to what ends. And how is that evaluation being used? So is somebody listening to the results of that evaluation? Is there an opportunity for learning? So is this reporting of what you found going to sit on an institutional website or reported to an academic board and then nothing happens? So there is a risk, I think, of performative evaluation, and what we need to develop is a culture, an evaluative culture, so that evaluation is valued and then there is learning that comes from it. So in a sense, the knowledge of what works is absolutely essential. So if there are people in this room who are evaluating the online, the hybrid, the blended, the distance, the whatever context or terminology that you use, I absolutely support and recommend that you think about open access publication, you think about disseminating on the broadest platforms so that people can learn and learn, you can share and people can learn. So in this kind of post-coronial times, the notion of evaluating is important, but it's also important that we do it well with rigour and robustness.
Can I also add that, of course, we've not come to bash digital at all. What we're doing now is finding what we've learned from it, and we found that there was a lot of evidence that you had to dig deep for, but it is out there, and it's really interesting that you almost don't know what you know until you know it, and that's the stage I think we're at now.
Yeah, absolutely. And gathering evidence can be really empowering. Once you know something's working, it gives you that confidence to do it again, or to make something better. And if you can see that evidence developing, I genuinely think it can be an empowering tool. But it also has to be resourced. You've got to find space. It's got to be valued within an institution as well, so that people doing it feel like they're supported. So a couple of things that we'll talk about in terms of what else might help. So we don't just want to come in here, throw a load of things at you and then leave in wonder or puzzlement or whatever we might be doing. But we wanted to try and also leave you with somewhere else to go or something else to think about. So the first thing is that myself and some colleagues across the higher education sector have written an evaluation manifesto. And at the heart of our evaluation manifesto is this notion of a space for critical reflection, an inclusive community of evaluators, and we believe that anybody with support can evaluate. This is not an exclusive club. And as a collection of people who have some experience in evaluation, we want to put back into the higher education community to help others to do that. So one of the things that I've taken one quote from the manifesto. There are 10 headline points which talk specifically about understanding impact and providing that space for reflection. And if you are interested in developing this from whatever platform, if you are a beginner, if you are immersed in evaluation, if you're just dipping your toe into this or wondering what the world of this means, then please do sign up using the link on the screen. Stella can also share the link with colleagues, and we're going to be running a series of hopefully quite inclusive events throughout the next academic year.
Yeah, it'd be really exciting as well. You don't have to have immense evaluative knowledge. I've signed up, and it's the idea of learning from different perspectives that have been talked about today, for example.
Yep.
Lots of you have got fantastic skills and abilities around the kind of technological stuff as well. It'd be really great if you want to contribute those thoughts to that as well. So the other bit of a quick plug is for us you can see there the Handbook of Digital Higher Education. Our chapter, and you're right, I love the word counterfactual, is researching the impact of learning through COVID-19 and beyond. Time for some critical and counterfactual thinking. And that's by me and Liz. But we did come across, particularly South American literature, lots of stuff that actually just throws up some different perspectives which it's well worth reading about. So what we've presented today actually is evidence we found, and then we've kind of melded that with our own issues, as you've all had through the pandemic, and come to some kind of formative conclusions, but that's all they are at this stage, so we'd really welcome that. We also know as evaluators that there's only 2 minutes to coffee time, so we're very happy if anybody wants to risk raising any questions so that everybody scowls at you before you get your 15 minutes break. If anybody's got any more questions, we'd be very happy to hear them, or do people think that would be deathly if they raise a question when everybody wants to leave the room?